So beautiful. Since I already did an unboxing of this on my last live stream, I was kind of conflicted if I even should do a dedicated video on this crank. But since it's an absolute dream part for me and actually ran into some issues, mostly due to my own stupidity as usual, so I thought it could be some information worth sharing, since this crank doesn't really get much attention here on the tubes. But before we get into that though, don't see my madness as buying advice. You could get a decent used bike for the price of this crank, and I think anyone who's considering buying this crank has already done a lot of extensive research on it and probably doesn't want to hear from some dork on YouTube if you should buy it or not. Even I didn't think I would actually ever buy this crank. It's always been one of those elusive parts that I always yearn for, looking, admiring from afar. But since we got this government check, or as I like to see it, an advance of our pension, but we won't have any pension left when we're old. Anyway, the rest is history. For being the lightest cranks on the markets, it would be silly not to include that information. So if you paid attention during the intro there, you've already seen that the crank itself came in at 310.8 grams. With the 42 teeth chainring from Wolftooth, that's a lot of tooths, the complete weight is 380.9 grams. And if we compare that with the Eastern crank with the Garbaruk chainring that I removed from the bike, that's a total weight saving of 80 grams. Is 80 grams worth the price of this crank? But yes, just look at it. So anyway, the issues I had installing this crank. First of all, the instructions are pretty confusing. Granted, I have dyslexia, so that didn't improve the situation that much, but I still think they could kind of make it a bit more easy to understand or follow along. It kind of starts off with including the BB installation guide into the crank installation instructions, which kind of made it very confusing, because since this is a 386 Evo bottom bracket, in the instructions for an installation of that, they say you don't need to use any spacers, which I took as the 2 spacers you get with the crank. I could just discard those and happy days, right? That didn't turn out to be the case, and once I put the crank in, I realized the chainring already touched the chainstay, and first I thought, oh crap, what have I done? Totally my fault. I should just have read more closely, and I would have realized that you actually use those spacers regardless of bottom bracket, but we'll get to that in a bit. The other issue that actually doesn't have anything to do with the instructions is the Wolftooth chainring bolts, which you can see here. I actually don't have them. The chainring bolts are the nut part, the ones that goes behind the chainring. The Wolftooth ones are pretty damn thick, so I had less than 1 millimeters of clearance between that bolt and the chainstay, and I didn't really want to risk anything, so I just got on Amazon and found some 1x chainring bolts that was a lot slimmer. As you see here now, I have plenty of space between the crank bolts and the chainstay. So that sorted that out, but could be a good thing to know. And those bolts actually saved me 2 grams, and since they are all black, it actually made the crank look a bit better, in my opinion. So I will just do a quick rundown of the installation steps I did, and hopefully it will help someone. A quick shout out though to Mr. Johnny TN for giving me a heads up on the installation procedure. That made it a bit easier for me to understand, even with my weird wired brain. So first, the spacers. On the drive side crank with a BB386 Evo bottom bracket, you use the 2mm spacer. Again, a bit confused by the instructions. Then we greased the crank spindle where the bearing seats and the bearings in the bottom bracket. Then I just put on the drive side bearing cover and inserted the crank from the drive side, obviously. I made sure to clean off any eventual grease that had come on those splines. You do not want to put any grease on the actual splines for the non-drive side crank, like you would if you had a metal spindle, for example. If you want to put something, you should actually put carbon paste. In my case, I just did it dry, and it seems to be fine thus far. Put the bearing cover on the non-drive side and then the cone sleeve with the remaining spacer. On with the non-drive side crank and the preload nut, screwing it in so that the cone sleeve and the spacer are flush against the bearing cover. This step is just to make sure everything is in the right place. If you would leave it like this, the preload would be way too high, and this was another step of the instruction I was a bit confused about. So after everything is pressed in and flush against the cover, you actually remove the preload nut again, and you might actually have to loosen the crank arm a bit as well. Make sure everything is spinning freely. Remove that crank bolt. Put a drop of Loctite on both the crank bolt and the preload screw. THM, say medium strength Loctite. I put on low strength here because I will actually remove this crank in the near future, trying to put in my new NTM bearings, but that will be another video. So then comes the final pre-loading step. And just like a Shimano crank, this is just finger tight to remove any kind of play in the crank and making sure it still spins smoothly without any extra drag. I think THM recommends something like 0.3 Newton meters to max 1 or something like that. But I just went by feel. If there's too much drag, I will just back off a bit and make sure there's no play in the crank until I'm satisfied. After that, I can tighten down the crank bolt to 10 Newton meters. And after that, I will go back to the preload screw and tighten that to 10 Newton meters as well. And this is just to make sure it doesn't come loose. Since we already tightened the crank bolt, it won't actually add any more preload to the system. That's a lot of rehab. We need to sort that someday soon. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And I'm so stoked that I actually own this crank now. Like I said, I never thought I would. I definitely no regrets. So I only had a few rides indoors and about 2 rides outdoors, and it's performing as one would expect. Super stiff carbon. I never felt any crank in my life not being stiff enough. So that was never an issue in the first place. Like last year, I will try to do a kind of a 1-year recap of all the crap I put on the bike during this 2020, and I will be sure to cover my experience, my long-term experience with this beauty, the new wheels of course, and other stuff I eventually get, maybe. I don't have any money left. If you have any questions about this amazing piece of art, feel free to drop them in the comments and I will try to answer to the best of my ability. For now though, I actually need to clean this, man. I think I almost have 2 rides without cleaning it, and this is not good for my reputation. So I will catch you in the next one. Peace!